While most presidents wore suit jackets, ties, and dress pants all the time, you don't have to any longer. Because Presidents Unplugged has merch. If you want to check out some new shirts to buy as a nice gift for somebody in your family or just something that you want yourself, go to presidentsunpluggedmerch.com to check out new shirts, hoodies, crew necks, and anything else that you can dream of. Now in many more colors and new designs coming soon. I'm very excited for the Presidents Unplugged merch store to finally be open. Now, let's get back to the show. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever episode of Presidents Unplugged, the show where we look at the United States presidents for who they really were. For this first ever episode, we're going to be talking about the first ever president, George Washington, the man, the myth, the legend. Born on February 22nd, 1732 in Virginia, George Washington was one of our 8 presidents from Virginia, tied with Ohio for the most in one state. George Washington came from a quiet, humble family. They were active in their community, but they were calm, they were quiet, and so was George himself. And when George Washington was just a little boy, he chopped down the cherry tree with his father's axe and said, "Father, I have mistaken." Except that was not true. Chopping down the cherry tree, while it's one of the most known things about George Washington, it's actually a myth. This myth was written in a book by Parson Weems in the early 1800s after George Washington had already died. But this book gave us another myth that a lot of people know about George Washington. His wooden choppers. He had wooden teeth, right? No, not actually. His teeth were actually made of gold, ivory, and even his own slaves' teeth. A sad truth, but an honest truth about presidential history. That shiny gold tooth that George Washington had must not have been too unattractive, though, because in his teenage years he met Martha Custis, who would later be Martha Custis Washington. Martha Washington became the first First Lady of the United States, and she began a lot of traditions that First Ladies still practice today. Parties in the White House, decorating it to be all pretty. Wait, what White House? Yes, the fun fact about George Washington is he never lived in the White House. They were building the White House during his term, but John Adams was the first president to live in the White House in 1800. So even though she didn't have a big White House to do stuff in, she did start the tradition that lots of First Ladies would follow in doing little parties and events to make the president's slot seem more inviting. And another thing, to go with Martha's parties, I'm going to tell you a fact that a lot of people don't know about George Washington. This man could dance, like, extremely well. At parties and balls that they held, he was known to be one of the best dancers in the room. Elegant, graceful, and always a gentleman. And it also tells us that Washington's moves weren't just on the battlefield. But sadly, dancing is not a job. If so, I might be a millionaire. But what did George Washington really do for work before he entered the militia and eventually became the president? Well, in his early years, he had a job as a surveyor. Now, what is a surveyor? A surveyor is somebody who measures and maps out land. Now, why is this important? Mapping out land and measuring things is helpful for construction and development in those areas. So even though the surveyor doesn't build the land themselves, they measure it for people who will in the future. So surveyors are very useful. George Washington started this job personally in his late teens. But what do you normally do in your late teens? Oh, you go to school. Well, George Washington didn't really have a formal education. We've had presidents like Harry Truman not go to college, but at least he went to grade school. George Washington never went to grade school or any form of school. He learned most of what he learned on his own or through his parents, who were great mentors to him to what he would one day become. But he wouldn't be a surveyor forever. The then not United States of America, but 13 colonies got in a little fight, a little war called the French and Indian War. George Washington himself wanted to be in the military, or the militia at that time, but he couldn't figure out how. But then somebody came in handy. George Washington's half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence is not only my middle name, but it was George Washington's half-brother who said, I know a way you can get in the militia. So having a connection to Lawrence Washington is what got George Washington himself in the French and Indian War. George Washington went into this war and did very well as a soldier, and eventually climbed up the ranks to be a general by the end of the war. So this war alone cemented George Washington as a pretty successful fighter. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to tackle war, and that war experience would come in handy very soon. The Revolutionary War, the war that gained us our independence from Britain. George Washington was the commander of the Continental Army, also known as the most important general in the United States. And this job, we can't understand today how important this job was. It was basically, he ran the whole entire military, which is incredible. George Washington did a great job at it as well. His men would often have to slow him down because they couldn't keep up with how fast and how on it George Washington was. He wanted to do stuff, so they often had to slow him down from his determination, is what we'll call it. And after the Revolutionary War, if you don't know the story, we won and we gained our independence from Britain. After we won the Revolutionary War, George Washington said, my work here is done, and went home to his estate that he got from his family at Mount Vernon, and just relaxed. Went back to farming. But here's the problem. Countries around the world looked at George Washington and said, why would you do that? You were the leader of basically the whole military in the country. Couldn't you just become the king or something? But George Washington didn't want to become a king. So he went back to his humble beginnings as a farmer on Mount Vernon. And he did that for a while. He enjoyed that. But the United States government needed somebody to step up and become the president of the United States. Well, who's going to be the president? George Washington. No other man had stood up to the ranks, been a great leader, and would be the perfect representation of the country through presidency. So George Washington leaves his estate at Mount Vernon and goes to the first ever capital of the United States, New York City. Now, normally presidents have to fight against someone. They have to campaign. They have to do all this stuff. But George Washington won the election unanimously. Unanimously. We need to understand today how important unanimously is. Nobody went against it. And the only other one that had ever been close to being a unanimous victory ever again was James Monroe in 1820. But that was because the other candidate, died. So let's just call George Washington special in this. He was the only president ever voted in unanimously. People loved George Washington. And the people showed him that love by electing him as their first ever United States president. Now, George Washington came into this position excited for what the nation has to offer. What does the president do? Well, George Washington didn't really have a president behind him to look at and take example from. So something that people don't realize is with an early nation, you need to start things. And George Washington started a bunch of presidential traditions. His eventual tradition to only run is 2 terms, I'm going to talk about that later, and the tradition that I'm going to talk about now, the inaugural address. The inaugural address is a little speech that the president gives at the beginning of their term, right when they come into office, to tell them about plans and to thank them for electing them as their United States president. Pretty cool. It gets people ready for who they just elected. George Washington's first ever inaugural address, and the first one in the nation's history, was about 700 words. Pretty normal, pretty standard. Some have been thousands of words, and some have been really short, just like George Washington's second inaugural address, which was the shortest inaugural address in history at only 135 words, a record that will probably never be broken again. And remember, George Washington had those wooden, gold, slave, janked up teeth. So he didn't like to speak for a long time. So that right there is your explanation why his second inaugural address was as short as it was. But there is a certain respect that I have for George Washington for starting us as a nation off so strong right from the beginning, and something that we should never forget to honor him for. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at Presidents_Unplugged. See you there. But his terms weren't all butterflies and rainbows. He couldn't do this president thing all by himself, so he had to elect a cabinet. A presidential cabinet are some leaders that presidents appoint to help them in certain pieces of government. So Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, a couple of different departments. So George Washington brought in Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and a few other men to lead these positions. But remember, this is before political parties, so the only real parties in the country were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. People who wanted the Constitution and people who really didn't want the Constitution. The two major people who were really for and against were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wanted more states' rights, and John Adams wanted more federal rights. So just like politics today, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson started fighting over which was better, which one the country should listen to, which one George Washington should listen to. And just like a father breaking up his two ravenous children, George Washington said, "Y'all, we're fighting for the same country, and you two are getting mad over these little things, when really together we're all fighting for the same cause." George Washington was a mediator in politics. He would remind them that they together made this beautiful country that they're living in. And you're going to fight about one small belief that you disagree on? It's the beginning of the United States of America. There's going to be tension. But George Washington didn't solve corruption and break up fights by making some big executive order or making some intense speech. He ended stuff like that by just humbly saying, "Y'all, look at the bigger picture. Don't fight over things like this. Have peace." And looking back, George Washington himself said it best in his farewell address in 1797, where he said, "These simple fights, these little problems that Americans have with each other will tear us apart as a nation." George Washington said that in his farewell address. But even through that message that he gave his people, he showed us one more idea of who he really was. After 8 years in the presidential office, Washington did something that, at the time, nobody had ever seen before. He gave up his presidential power. He could have stayed in that position for life. Nobody had been behind him to make an example. He was the first there. He could have been there forever. But he didn't. He stepped down, proving to all of us Americans that real leadership doesn't just mean knowing when to be big and powerful. It's also knowing when to walk away. That humble choice that Washington made still sets the standard for every president since, except Franklin Roosevelt. He was different. And it is a perfect way to sum up the George Washington message. Being the father of our country, he had to set standards. He had to make decisions, and he had to make sacrifices. And that truly proves to us why he is the father of our country. And that's what makes the man, the myth, the legend so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Theodore Roosevelt, a sickly kid from New York who rose through all the ranks against all odds, became one of the most influential presidents in all of American history. Learn about him and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. We need to make an executive decision now. The executive decision to follow Presidents Unplugged on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified weekly that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, let's get back to the show.